Since it turns out to be the last evening of this session, perhaps I could thank Tom and Jan, who had the inspired idea of setting up the Herodotus Helpline in the first place. And I'd like to acknowledge the contributors to all the seminars, which I've really very much enjoyed. I begin tonight with the case of the missing wine jars in Herodotus 3:6. What becomes of all those empty jars after they reach Egypt? Such clues within an ancient text may prompt ways of thinking about its later reception. Suggestive starting points in Herodotus Histories are the reuse of containers and building materials, the sending of messages, especially coded messages, the role of gifts, trade and exchange, the minting and circulation of coinage, and the fates of advisors and interpreters. How do authors treat their sources, engage with their audience, or imagine their own posterity? Darius's messengers were thrown into the pit or down a well. Phrynichus touched such a raw nerve that the Athenians fined him and banned his play. On the other hand, Ryan fulfills every writer's fantasy to be triumphantly revenged on the audience who forced him to perform. As Robert Browning says, "'Tis fable, therefore truth." The reception of Herodotus is more elusive than that of any other major writer of antiquity. This is partly because of the patchiness of the mediating texts, but more because of the nature of the histories itself. Capacious, multiform, polyphonic, incorporating both fictional and documentary modes, and aspiring to a universal account of human history. The nearest thing in English might be the encyclopedic modernist epic, Ezra Pound's Cantos, or James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, both of which struggle with a multiplicity of materials and hint at Herodotus' histories as their organising metaphor. For Pound, Ecbatana is the ideal city, harmoniously planned. At its centre, a treasure house, which is also a store of words. Great bulk, huge mass, thesaurus, Ecbatan, city of patterned streets. Joyce turns Herodotus into a model for his own version of world history, combining the erudite with the sensual and the dynastic with the domestic, becoming hereditary, Herodotisms, and my favourite, Herodotes. Rather than serving as pattern for a new epic, Herodotus more often appears piecemeal, a source of stories and anecdotes, freestanding dramatic scenes, or tragic moments. The original prose work is transformed in context, form, and scale, miniaturized into lyric, recast as elegy or dramatic monologue. Herodotean skepticism becomes modern irony. Whether travelling with Herodotus or writing back to him, modern poets come face to face with their own reflection. Today I discuss 6 writers who engage with Herodotus, beginning in 1899 with A.E. Housman. Housman was a professional classicist, a waspish textual critic, an arid teacher, and a fierce academic opponent. He also wrote some of the most moving and best-known lyric poems in English. Lydians, lord of Hermus river, sifters of the golden loam, see you yet the lances quiver and the hunt returning home? King, the star that shuts the even, calls the sheep from Tmolus down. Home returns the doves from heaven and the prince to Sardis town. From the hunting heavy laden, up the mission road they ride, and the star that mates the maiden leads his son to Croesus' side, and so on. Housman's Attis is a lyrical ballad in the dialogue form we recognise from both traditional and literary ballads. It sets off echoes from Sappho to Tennyson and R.L. Stevenson. It was only published after Housman's death, as he was unsure about the metrical form. He suspected he was overfond of this particular stanza, trochaic tetrameter with alternating feminine and masculine rhymes, which he considered the most beautiful and difficult in English. The stanza is usually associated with jaunty comic verse, but here the mood is one of a plangent melancholy. It uses tripping measures to express the profoundest pessimism, as Louis MacNeice put it. Or in the words of Christopher Ricks, it plays a bleak statement against an exquisite measure. The young Housman, like many Victorian schoolboys, was brought up with J.E. Bode's immensely popular Ballads from Herodotus. Bode aimed to bring out the drama in Herodotus and to point a moral. His dynamic narrative pulse is very unlike the ebb and flow of Housman's increasingly ominous dialogue. Housman's reading of the Attis and Adrastus story is essentially tragic. Skiason has shown how Herodotus uses patterns of Attic tragedy in the Lydian Logos. From the full course of such tragedy, Housman extracts the gold, the hunt, and the return. Adrastus not named, he is the Phrygian stranger, Herodotus Xenos. Croesus' dream is implicit but not mentioned, and the poem stops short before his appeal to Zeus. Like the Lydians who sift the gold specks from the psaegma washed down from Mount Tmolus, Housman picks out the gold in traditional sounding but new minted epithets. Sifters of the golden loam, finders of the golden vein, washers of the sands of gold. I had to check that these are not in fact attested compounds of chrysos and do not match any collocations in the histories. Housman's late Victorian diction nevertheless calls into play something authentically Herodotean, the calamitous consequences of Croesus' gold. In the same year as Housman wrote Attis, Cavafy wrote the first of his 3 Herodotus poems, all on Persian themes. Cavafy styled himself a poetis historikos, a historical poet, or perhaps poet-historian. He claimed if he hadn't written poetry, he could have written history. While aiming at accuracy and plausibility, he took a dramatic, ironic, and very personal view of history. His note here on his poem, The Naval Battle, declares a preference for Herodotus rather than Aeschylus as the more historically accurate. And he may also have been influenced by George Grote's preference for the accuracy of Herodotus' topography. His note on his poem, Darius, points to the way that historical figures and time periods are overlaid in his poems, Υπάρχει ανάμειξης χρόνων και προσώπων. In η Naumachia, the naval battle, Herodotus himself describes the Persian reaction to the defeat at Salamis, Book 8, as boer tekai oimorge. In an earlier seminar, we discussed the impact of this word oimorge at particular moments in the histories. In Cavafy's Naumachia, however, the Persian sailors echo, even parody, Aeschylus' chorus of Persian elders. Their lament spelt out as wordless cries, owa, owa, otatatoy. Cavafy's poem is made up of such exclamations interspersed with place names and the word Naumachia, and intensified through rhyme deixis and polyptoton. Recriminations are endlessly repeated. It's a cruel fact that other people's grief often sounds monotonous. While still returning in memory to the site of the disaster, Equis de Salamina, the Persians must get back to their own country. Θα πάμε στην Persepolis μας, και στα Susa. Although Cavafy never makes explicit reference to the political events of his own time, it has been suggested that the poem hints at modern Greek irredentism and the response of the Greek press and public to the Greco-Turkish War of 1897. As a Greek of the diaspora, living in Egypt, educated in English and French, Cavafy was drawn to moments and historical periods where different cultures are layered and juxtaposed. His poems, Otharios and Odimaratos, Darius and Damaratus, both explore the interrelationship of Persian and Greek identities, as seen from a later Hellenistic perspective. Otharios is set in 74 BC at the court of the Pontic king Mithridates VI Eupator. A fictional poet, Pharnaces, a Hellenized Persian, is at work on his epic poem Darius. Cavafy's poem forms a palindrome beginning with the title and ending with the name Therios. Similarly, the first verse paragraph begins and ends with the word opitis. The poet is both Pharnaces and Cavafy. The poet's challenge is to understand what Darius's feelings were on gaining the throne. Herodotus just says, after the groom story, and so he became king. Did he feel, perhaps, arrogance and intoxication, hyperopsian kemethin, or some realization of the futility of grandeur, tis mateotitos ton megalion? How far can we reconstruct ancient emotion? The question recurs in Cavafy, and I believe is also a current topic among classicists. Pharnaces' attempt to understand Darius is enacted through parentheses, choppy enjambments, questions, and words like issos, ochiomos, malonsan, perhaps, no, more like. Pharnaces is interrupted by the news that Mithridates has invaded Roman territory. Tis amphora, what a disaster, a deft modulation to free and direct style. It's time to leave Greek poems and invoke the old Persian gods. Sei megale tis asias prostate, voices demas. Mithridates, for all his Hellenizing cultural projects, is behaving like Darius, his Persian ancestor, and will suffer a similar fate. The ironic conjunction that Cavafy calls the anamics kroton ke prosopon points back to the Battle of Marathon and forward to the Roman conquest of Pontus. Mithridates' overreaching clinches the matter of Darius' supposed feelings. Topithanot Rowena Fowler, hyperopsian ke methin thaike Otharios. The word hyperopsia does not occur in Herodotus. I believe it's in Thucydides. But methi is suggestive. In an early essay, Persian Manners, Cavafy notes the importance of drink to the Persians, how their fondness for wine goes along with caution about its use by public figures. In the first sentence, being much given to wine, the Persians had a great esteem for those who could drink much liquor without getting intoxicated. And at the end, Herodotus tells us that they never adopt a resolution decided upon when drinking, and that it is first approved in their hours of soberness. Cavafy approaches the Persians through Herodotus, as read simultaneously in ancient Cappadocia and early 20th century Alexandria, outposts of Hellenism 2,000 years apart. From Darius to us today in 2020 involves 4 degrees of separation, all merged in the synchronicities of the poem. Phanarses never writes his epic, but his poetic process enables Cavafy to compose his own Therios. My next case study makes very different use of the Persians, Louis MacNeice's radio play, The Glory That Is Greece. The fortunes of ancient text in modern wars, particularly the First World War, have received much attention. I'd like here, though, to consider the Second World War and the way that Herodotus was pressed into service by the BBC as propaganda for the Allied cause. MacNeice, a poet of the 1930s generation associated with W.H. Auden, was a university lecturer in classics when war broke out. Medically unfit for the armed forces, he worked for the BBC and discovered a talent for sound radio. In the late 1930s, his bleak autobiographical poem, Autumn Journal, had expressed disillusionment with classical education, and even with the ancient world itself. It was all so unimaginably different, and all so long ago. After the Axis invasions, however, MacNeice looked at Greece with a fresh eye and a new urgency. His Salutation to Greece was broadcast on Greek National Day, the 25th of March, 1941, followed in April by the March of the 10,000, a version of Xenophon's Anabasis. This slide shows MacNeice himself and the page of the Radio Times advertising his play, The Glory That Is Greece. It went out on the Home Service on the 28th of October, 1941, the first anniversary of the Italian invasion, the first Ochi Day. The play incorporates substantial excerpts from Herodotus' account of Thermopylae, interwoven with imagined scenes set in the present day, with an Italian family listening to Mussolini's broadcast speeches and Greek soldiers deployed on the Albanian front. To give a flavour of the Herodotus passages, I chose the Spartan hair combing scene from Book 7. Persian Scout. These Persians who were in front of the wall, some of them were practicing jumps and somersaults. Some of them were combing their hair. Xerxes, what did you say? Persian Scout. Some of them were combing their hair. Combing their hair under the nose of my army. Where is Demaratus? I'm here, my lord. And so on. Despite Mardonius' attempt at cultural mediation, Xerxes finds the Spartans' custom galoia. This is a very Herodotean laughter, contemptuous, but fatally misdirected. Rewritten by MacNeice's dialogue, the passage turns the Persian king into a figure of fun, a propaganda method often used against Hitler and Mussolini. Meanwhile, modern Greek soldiers take inspiration from past battles. At the top, Stavros. All this has happened before. That's what it says in my books. And then Stavros further down at the end. Ah, you mean the old ones, the ones that built the Acropolis. That's right, Costa. They had their invasions too. The wars between Greece and Persia. Oh, I've heard about those. First, there was the invasion of Darius. What happened? We met them at Marathon, drove them into the sea. Yanni, that's what's coming to Musso. Though it was well received at the time, the play now seems to me wooden and didactic, less dramatic indeed than Herodotus' prose narrative. But no recording is extant. There has been no re-performance. We have to imagine the sound effects and the specially commissioned music. And although there is a cast list, including some famous actors, Michael Kakoyannis, Robert Speight, It doesn't specify who played which part. I feel it's not surprising that it's so difficult to reconstruct the context of Herodotean performance when we lack the full picture of a performance in our own country and language less than 80 years ago. I turn now to Eavan Boland and her Greek experience, which turns out to be a resistant reading of Cyrus's revenge on the river Ganges for the death of the white horse, Herodotus 1:189. This is an extract of about half the poem. In Boland's poem, an unnamed aspiring writer revisits the scene of disillusionment, the moment of revulsion from Herodotus' apparent complicity in violence. The disenchanted apprentice imagines Herodotus speaking, first to defend the need for iron men, and then to offer a disturbing exemplum, the diversion and division of the river. What here and now does this poem actually inhabit? My name means nothing here. His, Herodotus, towers in Babylon, salts the Aegean, is silted into each Ionic ear. One clue is the context of the surrounding poems, all rooted in Irish history, in Boland's volume, The War Horse. The War Horse was published in 1975 at the beginning of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. There are also clues in the poem itself, in the way violence takes the form of ambush, a familiar tactic in the Troubles, division, truce, and revenge. After graduating in English, Boland studied Greek for a year at Trinity College Dublin, hence her Greek experience. Herodotus Book 1, often prescribed as a text for beginners. The experience is of reading and learning and of a disquieting recognition. Herodotus becomes the malign angler, his school of stories, the transformation of Cyrus's cautionary tale to the Ionians of the fish rising to the flute player. She refers to that in another part of the poem. Herodotus is also morally obtuse, like Croesus, a mule. Boland reads or misreads the text, invoking a Herodotus perhaps of the 1960s and 1970s, one who uncritically admires the Persian king's exercise of power. In our own seminar series, Rosario Munson has shown how Herodotus is in fact alert to the Persians' use and abuse of water to control and subdue, in particular in 3:117. Boland's Greek experience raises questions about the validity of subjective reader response and recontextualized reading. In revisiting Herodotus as a chronicler of war, the American poet A.E. Stallings focuses on the aftermath of battle. Her recent sequence, The Battle of Plataea Aftermath, comprises 5 poems, mainly based on Book 9. Here is a list of the titles. You can see she's picked out, for instance, the Princess of Kos, Lampone, Aristodemus. All these 5 poems turn on a moment of reversal. The first, the Spartan generals, on the banquet staged by Pausanias for the defeated Persians. The structural contrast between Persian and Greek manners, which runs through the histories, is dissolved here into that dreadful Spartan national dish, the melastomos, of pork entrails cooked in pig's blood. We also laughed, though fed up with that food, the soldier's mess, the black broth of blood. This image brings the reader up short, as if the sight of the food makes the victors themselves recall from their gruesome memory of combat. I thought it was a strikingly modern metaphor, until Liddell and Scott sent me to Theophrastus, where a battle is described as polonton zomon, which Loeb translates as a huge bloodbath. The volume Like, in which the Battle of Plataea was published, plays throughout on various meanings and uses of the word like. Stallings feeds back into Herodotus the figurative language absent from the histories. In The Immortals, for instance, she uses an image that recalls early Greek hexameter poetry, as on mountain hunts, a pack of Spartan hounds surrounds the boar. We know she is a formalist poet who never writes prose. To honour Herodotus as a great prose writer, she sets out her sonnet sequence so that it looks like prose on her page. You can see on the next slide my own reconstruction, hypothetical reconstruction of her underlying versification. The elaborate and the prosaic, verse and prose, Persian and Spartan modes, perhaps, in one poem. I finish with a poem offering more appealing fare than the Melastomos. Michael Longley's Ashu. Here is the poet underneath his tree, not a pondicum tree, but he has his asci. The autobiographical and political context of this poem, asci, is described more in Alden's essay, The Argypay in Belfast. Longley and his wife had been founder members of a group bringing Catholics and Protestants together to promote culture and the arts in Northern Ireland. When the whole thing fell apart in bitter acrimony, Herodotus offered Longley a vision of an alternative life. It is time for that tonic called asci. The tone of the poem is wry, intimate, and self-deprecating. The Argypay are an odd-looking people, an unexpected model for your life in retirement. But classics, especially Greek poetry, are at the heart of Longley's work. The best-known examples would be his short lyric and elegiac poems out of Homer. In asci, he turns in his bitter spell to Herodotus. The Argypay are said to be holy, heroiga legonte enai, and importantly, they have no weapons of war, udeti areion hoplon ekteatai. They live in peace with their neighbours, they settle disputes, and give refuge to fugitives from justice. And so begins a new chapter in the history of the Irish in the Herodotean mirror. A welcome contrast to the make-believe Hyperboreans or the savage Scythians. The special drink of the Argypay lends the poet and his wife a kind of immunity, protectively wrapped, like the winter trees in the rhymes asci, tree, you and me. In bitter spells they wrap the trunks with felt as thick and white as the snowy weather. A weird sanctity protects you and me while we stay under our ponticum tree. Thank you very much.